Some tragedies are buried by time, others are buried by silence. But the ones we should fear most are those buried by choice. There are stories we tell to remember, and then there are stories we bury to forget. This is one of the latter. And yet, no amount of dirt, no pile of forgotten paper, no whisper of old winds through tall grass can truly silence what happened in the summer of 1812. Not here, not in Illinois, not in that quiet, wooden childcare home that once stood far from the eyes of the world. It's easy to let time do what it does best: erase, replace memory with myth. Let nature reclaim what human hands failed to protect. But under that soil still lies a truth too heavy to stay buried. 45 children, innocent, fragile, unseen, all gone in a matter of weeks. They weren't soldiers, they weren't politicians, they weren't written about in the journals of war or named in the speeches of men. They were just children, small voices, small shoes, small dreams, who lived in a place built to shelter them from the world, a place that promised care, warmth, and safety. But it failed them, not with violence, not with open cruelty, but with something perhaps far worse: neglect wrapped in silence. And silence is a slow death all on its own. This wasn't a battlefield where enemies clashed. It wasn't a natural disaster that shook the world. It wasn't an act of rage or vengeance. It was a slow, creeping tragedy, hidden behind the cracked walls of a childcare home, far from the cities, deep in the rural heart of America. No one saw it coming, or maybe they did and chose not to look. The summer of 1812 was blistering. The air was thick, wells ran dry, crops withered, and somewhere inside that home, where dozens of children slept on straw beds and waited for morning porridge, a sickness was growing. One cough, one fever, one shiver. At first, they called it nerves, the heat, perhaps, a passing stomach bug. But it didn't pass. One child fell, then another and another and another. Within days, the halls were filled with the sounds of weak crying and shallow breaths. There were no doctors. There was no medicine. Only caretakers, few and overwhelmed, left to choose between hope and helplessness. And soon, even they stopped choosing. They let the dying fade, one by one, quietly, without names, without records, without dignity. The walls of that home did not echo with screams. No, this was not a loud tragedy. It was quieter, slower, like a field of flowers rotting from the roots while the sun still shined above. A tragedy so slow, so silent, that it almost went unnoticed. Almost. Because the truth has a strange way of clinging to the earth, especially when it involves children. There were no funerals, no processions, no mourning families. Many of these children were already forgotten by the world the moment they were born. Orphans, abandoned, unwanted. And so when they died, 45 of them, they were not given names on gravestones. They were not given last rites. They were not even given full graves. Just a patch of land, turned over quickly, a burial not of honor but of inconvenience. And then, nothing. No investigation, no inquiry, no headlines. History moved on. The War of 1812 waged, borders shifted, names were remembered for battles and treaties. But not for the children, never for the children. Their deaths didn't shape policy. Their suffering didn't write law. They were, in the coldest language possible, erased. But the soil remembers. And when you walk that land, if you know where to look, you feel it. A strange stillness, a weight beneath your feet. Not of bones, but of stories left untold. Of laughter that never had a chance to grow old. Of lives that were cut short before they even began. This is not just a story about disease. It's not just about failed caretakers, or overwhelmed institutions, or the cruelty of 19th century medicine. It's about what happens when the voiceless are abandoned completely. When those who promise to protect choose convenience over care. When society looks away not out of ignorance, but out of will. Because there are many kinds of death: the body, the memory, the truth. These 45 children died all three deaths, and for over 2 centuries no one came back for them. No one asked, no one answered, until now. In the early years of the 19th century, America was still a country in its infancy. The East buzzed with trade, politics, and growing cities, while the West remained a vast, uncertain frontier. Illinois, not yet a state but a territory carved out from the wilderness, stood in between, neither settled nor wild, but something in between. It was a place of promise and hardship, of new beginnings and dangerous ends. Roads were scarce, communities were scattered, and the rule of law was often just a suggestion. Life was difficult, and for the vulnerable, especially for orphans and abandoned children, life could be crueler than death. It was in this uncertain soil that a small childcare home was built. Not by the government, not by the church, but by private hands. People who claimed to be acting out of kindness, duty, perhaps even divine calling. The building itself was modest. A 2-story wooden structure with a long front porch, its boards nailed together from local timber. It stood alone, miles away from the nearest township, surrounded by fields and woods. There were no neighbors to check in, no officials passing through. Just silence, broken only by the wind and the distant sound of wagons making their slow journey east or west. The childcare home was meant to be a refuge, a place where children, many of them found wandering, abandoned, or handed over by desperate parents, could receive care, shelter, and instruction. In a time when no centralized system of foster care existed, places like this operated in a gray area. They were both sanctuary and prison, salvation and neglect. There were no standard inspections, no laws outlining child protection. Once a child entered, they were invisible to the outside world. The home began with perhaps noble intentions. In the beginning, there were just a handful of children, 6 or 7 according to the few documents that remain. They slept on cots lined along the walls of one large upstairs room. They rose with the sun, did chores, learned their letters from worn-down slates, and sang hymns before bed. Food was basic: porridge, bread, dried meat. Water came from a well not far from the back of the house. Everything about life there was simple, rustic, and harsh. But over time, the number of children grew. More and more parents, overwhelmed by poverty or illness, began leaving their sons and daughters at the doors of this isolated building. Some came willingly, hoping their children might have a better life inside than out. Others were left in the middle of the night, blankets clutched around shivering bodies, with no explanation or goodbye. It wasn't long before the home swelled beyond its intended capacity. Rooms meant for 10 children held 20. Supplies ran low. Bedding was shared. Illness became common, and yet the home continued. Its operators, whether family, religious sect, or hired caretakers, were left to their own devices. There was no one to question their methods, no one to audit their books, no one to ask how many children lived there, how many died, or how many simply disappeared. They operated in the quiet confidence that no one would come looking too closely. That's what made it dangerous. Because when isolation becomes normal, oversight disappears. And when oversight disappears, so does accountability. The childcare home's isolation wasn't just geographical. It was moral, emotional, societal. These were not wealthy children, not children of status or reputation. Most had no last names, no birth certificates, no records of origin. In the eyes of the growing American society, they were shadows, barely real. Their value was determined only by how much trouble they caused or how quietly they obeyed. They were, for all practical purposes, invisible. In this environment, things could happen. Things did happen. There were rumors, even in those early years. Whispers carried by the rare peddler who passed through, or the mail courier who noted a strange silence around the building. Some claimed they saw children working in the fields, too small for the tasks assigned to them. Others said they saw children's faces in the windows, not laughing, not playing, just watching, staring out at nothing, hoping for something. But again, the home was isolated, and rumors fade quickly when there's no one to listen. The home never had a name. That was perhaps intentional. No plaque, no title carved into the wood. It was simply the home, a place spoken about with either respect or fear, depending on who you asked. But even that faded over time. New settlers arrived, focused on carving out their own survival. Old families moved away. The home remained, but it began to disappear from maps, from conversations, from memory. And yet it still held children. Children who woke up every day without knowing what tomorrow would bring. Children who didn't get birthdays, who didn't get visitors, who didn't get hugs, just daily tasks, cold floors, and a routine that felt more like survival than growth. By 1812, the home had become something else entirely. No longer a refuge, no longer a promise. It had become a holding place for forgotten souls. A warehouse of tiny breathing burdens kept out of sight, out of mind. Managed not with love, but with discipline. Maintained not with care, but with routine. That summer, the walls of that house stood still, wooden, weathered, silent. But inside, something was waiting, something that would soon steal 45 lives. To understand that tragedy, you must first understand how such a place could exist. Not just the building, but the culture that allowed it, the indifference that allowed isolation to flourish, the quiet complicity of a growing nation more focused on expansion than compassion. That childcare home did not fail overnight. It failed long before the first child took ill. It failed the moment it was left alone, tucked between trees and silence, while the rest of the world looked westward toward opportunity and forgot the smallest among them. The isolated beginning wasn't just about geography, it was about abandonment, and that was just the beginning. To understand the depth of what was lost in that terrible summer, one must first grasp what was promised to these children when they entered the gates of the home. It was never grandeur or luxury, not riches, not even comfort. What was offered was something far more basic, yet profoundly precious: hope. In a world where many of these children had already tasted rejection, hunger, and abandonment, the home stood as a beacon, faint but glowing, in a darkened sky. It claimed to provide stability, shelter, and above all, a second chance. To the outsider, especially to desperate mothers and grieving fathers, the home seemed like salvation. The wooden fence surrounding it was meant to protect, not trap. The porch, though weather-beaten, offered a sense of domesticity and routine. Smoke rose from the chimney at predictable hours. The sight of laundry on the line, or a child sweeping the steps, gave the illusion of order. If one stood far enough back, the image was almost picturesque, like something pulled from a storybook about frontier life. But illusions are often crafted with great care, and this one was no different. Inside, the children were greeted by rules, structure, and a new identity. Their old clothes were taken and replaced with uniforms, simple cotton garments, gray or beige, designed for function, not comfort. Their names were sometimes shortened or changed entirely. Some children forgot their birth names within months. Birthdays weren't celebrated. Laughter was quiet and curiosity was not encouraged. But still, there was food, there was shelter, and for many, that alone was a gift. Routine dominated their lives. The day began before sunrise. Beds made quickly. Wash basins shared. Breakfast was thin porridge or bread dipped in milk. Chores were assigned. Older boys chopped wood. Older girls tended the garden or helped sew. The younger ones scrubbed floors, carried water, or looked after each other. Schooling came in short lessons, memorized scripture, recited alphabets, occasional arithmetic. The caretaker taught from memory or from a tattered book passed down over the years. There were no toys, no games, except those they invented among themselves. Even those had rules. Laughter too loud would draw warnings. Whispers that turned to giggles could earn punishments. But even in the tightest cages, children find cracks to breathe through. Some found refuge in each other. Siblings who arrived together often clung to one another as if separation would be the final betrayal. Others formed quiet friendships, bonded not by shared joy, but by shared survival. They whispered under blankets, shared crusts of bread, protected one another from harsher discipline. In stolen moments, they played with pebbles, sang lullabies remembered from home, or stared out the small windows, imagining the world beyond the trees. And then there was the chapel room, a small, plain space where daily prayers were held. Here, hope was offered not in physical form but spiritual. The children were told to be grateful, to endure hardship with grace, that suffering would earn them a place in heaven. They were taught that obedience was holy, that pain could be sacred. And slowly, that message sank deep. So deep that many began to believe that the cold they felt each night, the hunger they battled, and the sickness they watched grow inside others was somehow deserved. But even with this harsh conditioning, some held on to hope. Hope that someone would return for them. That one day they would be adopted by a kind family. That they would be taken to a town with paved roads and laughter in the streets. That maybe, just maybe, the home was a doorway, not an ending. Each knock at the door, each stranger who visited was a chance. Children lined up straighter, smiled wider, hoped harder. But more often than not, those visitors came and went without a word, and the children remained behind those closed doors. And yet, hope lived on. Hope in the way a girl secretly embroidered her name into the hem of her dress, believing someone might one day recognize her. Hope in the way a boy buried a carved wooden animal beneath the garden, believing it would survive longer than he would. Hope in the way they memorized the shapes of the stars through the attic window, certain the sky would still know their names, even if no one else did. But behind the hope, reality loomed. The food was running thinner. Supplies were wearing out. The caretakers, once strict but composed, grew frustrated and short-tempered. New arrivals were met with less warmth, fewer resources, colder eyes. The home had become too full. Beds were shared. Illness spread. But still they prayed. Still they whispered dreams. Still they believed that what they were enduring was a temporary test, not a permanent sentence. That's the cruelest part of it all, because hope is what kept them obedient. Hope is what kept them silent. Hope is what allowed them to wait in their beds, even as their bodies weakened. It was the light in their chest that kept flickering, even as the darkness outside grew thicker. Behind those doors, those wooden walls, beneath the roof that groaned each time the wind blew hard, there was still hope. Fragile, delicate, flickering. It existed in the hum of a lullaby, in the way two children held hands during prayer, in the way a boy drew a picture of a house with smoke curling from the chimney, his version of a happy ending. They were waiting for better days, for open doors, for someone to come and see them, but no one did. And that summer, hope met its match, not in fire or flood, but in silence, in sickness, in stillness, behind those very same doors where it had once been born. And slowly, one by one, those little flames went out. Summer no one could have imagined. The year was 1812. The war had begun. Washington, D.C. trembled with anticipation as battles brewed across the Eastern Front. But far from the noise of cannons and the echo of marching boots, in the quiet plains of Illinois, a different storm was beginning to rise. One without warning, without violence, and without the attention of the world. It was not marked by gunfire, but by silence. And in that silence, something horrific began to unfold within the walls of a forgotten childcare home. At first, it was just another summer. The sun hung high over the Illinois plains, burning down on the yellowing grass and the creaking wood of the orphanage. The sky was a relentless sheet of pale blue, without clouds, without rain. Day after day, the heat grew heavier. What had begun as a season of routine, a time for gathering crops, mending fences, and cleaning the well, soon turned into a suffocating struggle for breath, for shade, for survival. The children, already thin and fragile, began to sweat through their clothes before midday. Water became precious. The well that once offered cool relief now sputtered with hesitation, its levels sinking with every passing day. Inside the home, the air was worse. The windows, nailed shut to keep out animals and bad spirits, trapped the heat like a coffin. The wooden floorboards burned under bare feet. The attic where the older boys slept became an oven by dusk. Children wiped their brows with sleeves soaked in sweat. They begged for extra water. They cried quietly into their thin pillows at night, praying for a breeze that never came. The caretakers waved away their complaints. "Offer it to God," they'd say. "This heat will pass. Just be strong." But the heat was only the beginning. Within weeks, the first signs appeared. A cough here, a fever there. At first, it was nothing alarming. Children got sick all the time, especially in homes like these, where hygiene was poor and space was tight. But this time, something felt different. The sick didn't get better. Their eyes grew hollow. Their breath became shallow. Their skin turned pale, then gray. One young girl began to vomit uncontrollably. A boy fainted while sweeping the steps and never fully regained his strength. The other children, frightened but obedient, were told to avoid them, to pray for them, but not to worry. "This happens in heat," the caretakers insisted. "Let them rest." But rest wasn't enough. In the first week, one child died. He was 5, quiet, timid. A boy who loved collecting feathers and lining them up beside his bed. No one knows his name. The caretakers wrapped him in a sheet and buried him behind the home near the well. No ceremony, no marker, just a prayer muttered under the breath. The children were told not to speak of it. They were told he had gone to heaven, that he was lucky, that he was at peace. But peace was nowhere to be found. By the second week, the number of sick had doubled. Children who had once been healthy were now collapsing during chores. One girl stopped speaking altogether. She stared at the ceiling for hours, unmoving, her body burning with fever. The caretakers, Fewer in number now due to some leaving or falling ill themselves, struggled to maintain order. They locked the sick in one room. They tried herbal remedies. They rationed water. They prayed. But prayers didn't cool the skin. They didn't ease the vomiting. They didn't bring back the children who began dying, one by one, then two by two. By the third week, panic began to take root. But among the children, the older ones began to whisper. They counted the empty beds. They marked the growing silence in the dining room. The songs they used to sing before bedtime stopped. Even the youngest, too small to understand death, began to sense the heaviness in the air. Some clung to each other. Others curled up in corners and rocked themselves to sleep. They were not told what was happening. They were not comforted. They were simply told to behave. The dining room, once a place of routine, became a quiet chamber of fear. The food, already sparse, grew thinner. Bowls were served half full. Some children couldn't eat even when it came. They were too sick, too nauseous. The caretakers refused to call for outside help. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was shame, or maybe they knew no one would come even if they asked. After all, this home was isolated for a reason. There were no nearby neighbors, no doctors close enough to reach in time. The only people who might have helped were the ones choosing to look away. The sickness had no name. Even today, we don't know exactly what it was. Typhoid, dysentery, a combination of diseases born from heat, filth, and dehydration. But it didn't need a name to do its work. It tore through the home like fire and dry brush, leaving behind lifeless bodies and unanswered questions. The caretakers tried to keep it quiet. They buried the dead in the field behind the barn, like far from the children's view. But children know. Children see. Children feel the emptiness even when no one tells them what it is. By the fourth week, the numbers were horrifying. The home, once filled with laughter, chores, and prayers, had become a tomb. Rooms smelled of sickness and sweat. Beds sat empty or occupied by silent, dying forms. Flies gathered at windows. Buckets of water, brought in from the shallow, drying well, did little to cleanse the mess. There was no more denying it. The children were dying, and no one was stopping it. And still, the outside world remained silent. No messenger arrived. No doctor rode in. No preacher came to offer last rites. The home was alone, swallowed by the land that had once seemed so full of promise. The war to the east raged on, drawing attention, resources, and sympathy. But this quiet war, this war of heat and neglect, was invisible. And that is what makes this tragedy unbearable. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't a single day or act. It was slow. It unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion, with each day offering more dread, more loss, more silence. And through it all, the children waited. They waited for help. They waited for a rescue. They waited for someone to notice, but no one did. By the end of the summer, just 8 weeks after that first boy died, 45 children were gone. 45. They died slowly, painfully, many without even a hand to hold. Their graves were unmarked, their names lost, their stories untold. The home, battered and hollowed, stood in silence. And when the first autumn wind blew across the fields, it carried with the last whispers of a summer no one wanted to remember. Because what happened in that summer wasn't just a failure of care. It was a failure of humanity, a failure of society, a failure of every person who didn't come, who didn't ask, who didn't act. The summer of 1812 in that lonely childcare home wasn't just hot. It wasn't just dry. It was deadly, and it was forgotten until now. What began as a few isolated fevers had now become a full-scale outbreak. No one called it by name because no one knew what to call it. There were no laboratories, no experts, no testing kits. There were only symptoms and suffering. The disease came fast, invisible and unrelenting, and left behind nothing but cold bodies and the thick scent of rot in its wake. It began in the gut. Children complained of stomach pain, sharp and twisting, followed by diarrhea that would not stop. Their bodies, already malnourished, could not afford to lose more fluids. Some vomited until they had nothing left to give. Fevers spiked to terrifying heights. The smallest children hallucinated, crying out for their mothers, screaming at invisible shadows crawling across the walls. Others lay still, not speaking, not moving, just waiting. It spread fast. The rooms were crowded, beds were shared. Buckets of water used for washing were also used for drinking. One wooden spoon might be shared between 5 mouths. and the latrines, poorly dug and too close to the well, were overflowing. Waste seeped into the ground. Flies buzzed everywhere, on the walls, on the food, even on the faces of the children, too weak to swat them away. No one was safe, not even the caretakers. But instead of acknowledging the truth, the people in charge chose denial. They insisted it was a summer sickness, a seasonal fever. They told the children to pray harder, to stop complaining, to be grateful for the roof over their heads. Some said it was divine punishment for disobedience, for sin, for lack of faith. The caretakers, who had once handed out porridge and patrolled the halls with stern dignity, now looked desperate, angry, afraid. They stopped entering the children's rooms unless absolutely necessary. They avoided the sick entirely. Meals were shoved into rooms without comment. Buckets of dirty water sat for hours before being replaced. When a child died, they were wrapped in old sheets and dragged out the back door in silence. No goodbyes, no candles, just a cold, frightened urgency to be rid of the body before another child touched it. And still, the disease raged on. No child was taken to town for help. No messenger was sent. The home remained sealed, as if closing its doors could keep the sickness from escaping. In truth, there was no one to call. No hospitals nearby, no real doctors, just country healers with poultices and prayers. But even that would have been something. Instead, the caretakers chose silence. Whether out of pride, fear of judgment, or simple indifference, they allowed the suffering to continue unchecked. The children began to understand what was happening, even if no one explained it. They stopped asking questions. They stopped expecting answers. Those still able to walk took over simple caretaking duties, feeding the weaker ones, cleaning their messes, holding their hands as they drifted in and out of delirium. Little ones stroked each other's hair and whispered lullabies. Older ones sat by the windows, staring out into the hot, still countryside, waiting for someone, anyone, to come down the road. No one ever did. The days lost meaning. There was no longer a difference between morning and night, only the rhythm of pain and silence. Some children began to go blind. Others bled from the mouth. Some died suddenly, collapsing mid-sentence. Others took days, slowly slipping away as their bodies failed them. There were no records, no charts, no notes, just empty beds and growing silence. One by one, their names vanished into the air. Denial became the home's only policy. Denial that they were in over their heads. Denial that this was more than they could handle. Denial that the children were dying in numbers too large to hide. And death became a routine. Just another task, just another chore. The caretakers grew colder with each burial. By the time the 30th child died, they no longer flinched. Their hands moved with grim efficiency, digging shallow graves, lowering bodies in, patting the dirt flat. The graveyard, if you could call it that, had no order, no names, no rows, just mounds of earth in a forgotten field where even the birds had stopped singing. Inside the home, the smell changed. It was no longer just sweat and wood and sickness. It was death. It lingered in the halls. It clung to the blankets. It soaked into the walls. The building itself began to rot from within, just like the bodies it held. The floorboards warped from spilled water and blood. The windows fogged with fevered breath. The roof sagged with heat and weight. The home was dying along with its children. And still the world outside continued on. The war raged. Crops failed. Mail was delayed. Life moved forward. But here in this isolated pocket of pain, time had stopped. The only calendar that mattered now was the count of how many were left. And with each day, that number shrank. Some children fought to the end. They clutched old dolls or sticks carved into toys. They whispered prayers with cracked lips. They held the hands of their friends until the very last breath. Others died alone, eyes open, staring into the dark corners of the ceiling, waiting for something that never came. There was no rescue, no redemption, just the final exhale, and then silence. The caretakers began to break under the weight of it all. Some fled, others fell ill. One was found sitting in the chapel, unmoving, staring at the altar for hours. Another locked herself in a pantry and refused to come out. They had run out of answers, out of faith, out of time. By the 6th week, the home had become a grave in waiting. The remaining children, barely 10 or 15, no longer spoke. They huddled together in corners, eyes sunken, skin pale and dry. They no longer asked for food. They no longer wept. They simply waited. The disease had done its work. but it had not worked alone. Neglect was its companion, denial was its accomplice, and death was its reward. This wasn't just a tragedy of illness, it was a tragedy of silence, of inaction, of grown men and women refusing to see what was happening right in front of them. These children didn't die only from disease, they died from being forgotten, from being ignored, from being treated like burdens instead of lives. And when it was finally over, when the last child's breath had faded, when the last grave had been dug, the home stood quiet. The halls were empty, the beds were cold, and the world still didn't know what had happened. But the earth knew. And the wind that blew across those fields carried with it the whispers of 45 children who died not with a scream, but with silence. When the final child's breath had escaped into the still, humid air, the home was no longer just a building, it was a tomb. 45 children had died, not all at once, but slowly, day by day, like the turning of pages in a book no one wanted to read. What should have followed this unthinkable tragedy was investigation, accountability, justice. But instead, what followed was perhaps the most chilling chapter of all: silence. The authorities, those tasked with protecting the vulnerable, enforcing the law, and safeguarding public welfare, did nothing. Not immediately. Not later. Not ever. In the territorial records of Illinois for the year 1812, there is no mention of an epidemic at the orphanage. No notes about a mass burial. No documentation about the deaths of 45 children. There are no letters from officials, no declarations of mourning, no calls for inquiry. It is as though the home and the children within it had simply vanished, as though they had never existed. This was not due to a lack of awareness, it was due to a lack of will. The silence of the authorities did not begin after the children died. It began while they were still alive. The signs were everywhere: children collapsing in fields, missing school lessons, being buried hastily behind the home in unmarked graves. The home had once submitted basic reports to a local parish. By midsummer, those reports stopped. No one asked why. Supplies that had once been delivered by traveling traders were no longer being ordered. No one asked what the children were eating. Children who were seen once by local townspeople, peering from wagon rides into nearby villages, were suddenly gone. No one asked where they went. The local township had a sheriff. He passed near the orphanage at least once a month. He never stopped, never asked to look inside. The regional magistrate lived only 30 miles away, but 30 miles on horseback was a half-day's ride, and by all accounts, no such visit ever took place. Even clergy, who often held the final word in community morality, remained distant. Perhaps they had suspicions. Perhaps they were told lies. Perhaps they believed suffering was a test of the soul. Or perhaps they, too, saw the children as shadows, too poor, too powerless, too voiceless to matter. And so the silence continued. It wasn't just passive, it was active. When eventually faint rumors reached neighboring towns that something awful had occurred at the childcare home, those stories were quickly dismissed. Illness is common in such places, some said. Children die all the time. There was no wrongdoing. No one is to blame. With each excuse, the silence hardened like clay in the sun, sealing the truth beneath layers of apathy. There may have been whispers. Perhaps a neighbor asked quietly why so few children were seen anymore. Perhaps a delivery man wondered why no one came out to greet him. But in those times, when poverty was rampant and suffering was normalized, few dared raise their voices, especially for children who had no families to speak for them. Even in the records that did exist, ledgers, church logs, grain purchase sheets, references to the home slowly vanished. It faded from written language the way a stain disappears beneath a second coat of paint. The building, once marked on rudimentary maps as a children's lodge, was later labeled simply as property or farmstead. Eventually, it was removed altogether. This was no accident. This was erasure. A deliberate attempt to cover over the kind of truth that shames a community, haunts a nation, and breaks the illusion of moral righteousness. It is easier to erase the story than to answer for it. Easier to forget the faces than to confess why they were allowed to die. And what about the caretakers? Some left. Some were quietly absorbed back into society. Some moved east. Some remarried. They told new stories about their pasts. They claimed experience in education or healthcare. Some may have felt guilt. Others, nothing at all. There is no record of anyone being charged, no tribunal, no reckoning. They vanished into the same silence they had once enforced upon the children. Even years later, when survivors of that era recalled the orphanage, they did so with hesitation. An old woman once said, "There was a house where children lived, but the Lord took many." A man, when pressed, said, "It's best not to talk of that place. Nothing good ever grew there." Oral history became cryptic, broken. No one wanted to admit they had known. No one wanted to be the voice that called for justice too late. And the government? By the time Illinois became a state in 1818, the tragedy had already been buried, literally and figuratively. Statehood brought new laws, new records, new agendas. There were roads to build, railways to plan, political boundaries to draw. There was no space for a story about a wooden house in the middle of nowhere where 45 children died in silence. The past was inconvenient, and so it was not written. But silence is not the same as peace. Peace brings closure. Silence brings forgetting, and forgetting is the final violence done to the dead. For the 45 children who perished that summer, there were no headstones, no names etched into marble. There were no mourning services, no candlelit vigils. There were only wildflowers growing over sunken soil, and a few faded memories held by people who were either too broken or too afraid to speak. What makes this tragedy unbearable is not just the disease, not just the heat, not just the mistakes. It's the quiet complicity of everyone who chose not to act. The sheriff who rode past, the priest who never knocked, the neighbor who turned their head, the clerk who buried the records, and every official who decided, through silence, that these children were not worth remembering. That kind of silence isn't ignorance, it's a decision. And in that decision, a second death occurred. The first was of the body, the second was of truth. And that second death lasted for over 200 years. When a home is built with promises of care, when a building is named a sanctuary, when hands are raised in prayer over the lives of children, it carries with it a sacred vow. Even in the most primitive corners of young America where survival often outweighed comfort, that vow mattered. The vow to protect, to nourish, to be more than a roof, more than meals, more than discipline, to be a harbor in a world already too cruel for the fragile shoulders of children. But at the 1812 childcare home in Illinois, that vow, spoken, unspoken, written between lines of charity and spiritual obligation, was broken. Not once, not twice, but again and again, until what remained was not a place of safety, but a cage of slow punishment. And those caught inside were children, most too young to understand what was happening, too powerless to stop it, too abandoned to escape. This was not only a story of disease. This was not just about a lack of medicine or food or oversight. It was also about the cruelty that can grow quietly when no one is watching. The kind of cruelty that hides behind purpose, the kind that wears discipline like armor and calls suffering holy. It was about how purity itself, innocence, obedience, silence, was turned into a weapon, and how children, desperate for love, learned to punish themselves just to stay alive. In those days, the spiritual worldview of the frontier was as unforgiving as the land itself. Suffering was seen not as a tragedy, but as a test. Hardship, especially for the young, was considered a pathway to strength, character, even salvation. For the poor and the orphaned, this belief became law. If a child complained of hunger, it was because they lacked gratitude. If they cried, it was because their faith was weak. If they fell ill, it was because their spirit was being tested. In this environment, compassion was not withheld out of malice. It was withheld in the name of righteousness. This belief system was deeply embedded in the childcare home's routines. Children were not nurtured, they were trained. Their bodies were not soothed, they were controlled. Their pain was not eased, it was reinterpreted as purification. It began in subtle ways. A child who cried too often was made to kneel on hard wooden floors for hours. A girl who wet the bed was made to stand outside barefoot before sunrise, her soaked sheets tied to her back. A boy who stuttered during prayer was forced to repeat the same verse 300 times, alone in the chapel room, while others ate. These punishments were not called cruelty, they were called correction. They were not seen as violence, but as a necessary part of discipline. The caretakers didn't use whips. They didn't need to. They used silence, cold meals, isolation, public shame. Children were ranked by obedience. Those who cried were separated from those who did not. Those who asked questions were labeled difficult. The idea was to break the will gently, so gently the child wouldn't know it had been broken until they could no longer feel anything at all. And slowly it worked. The children began to punish themselves. They turned pain into routine. Some refused to eat until all others were finished. Others asked to sleep on the floor, even when there was space in the bed. One girl, only 6 years old, stopped speaking altogether, not out of trauma, but because silence had become her identity, a badge of worthiness. Even kindness became a kind of quiet competition. A child who gave away their bread was praised for selflessness, never mind they were starving. A boy who worked all day despite fever was praised for strength, not questioned about his health. The caregivers believed they were shaping moral character. What they were really shaping was guilt. Children began to equate suffering with value. And worse, many began to believe they deserved it. This culture of spiritual punishment laid the foundation for everything that followed in the summer of 1812. When the disease arrived, slow and invisible, many of the children didn't report their symptoms. They had been trained not to complain, to endure, to trust that pain was temporary. Some even believed their sickness was a punishment for some unknown sin. So they hid their coughs. They forced themselves through chores. They whispered their discomfort only to each other. And by the time they collapsed, it was late. Caretakers did not react with panic, but with routine. They separated the sick into one room. They offered no medicine, only prayers. "You must endure this trial," one caregiver reportedly said to a shivering boy. "Let the fire cleanse you." Another was known to place her hand on a child's burning forehead and whisper, "If this is your path to heaven, be grateful." In any other time, in any other place, this would be called madness, abuse, torture. But in this home, it was disguised as faith. The children, already weak, now had another battle to fight. The belief that their deaths were meaningful, that their slow, painful end was noble. They were told they were chosen, that the suffering of the flesh would set their souls free. This wasn't meant to comfort. It was meant to control, to keep them still, to keep them quiet, even as their friends died beside them, even as the smell of decay seeped into the walls, even as the burials became more frequent than the meals. Even then, they were expected to smile through the pain, to be brave, to be pure. There is one account, though undocumented officially, passed down through fragmented oral history, of a child who tried to run. He made it as far as the fence line before collapsing from exhaustion. They brought him back, not to heal him, but to shame him. He was denied food for 3 days. He was made to sit in the center of the dining hall during meals, watching others eat. They didn't beat him. They didn't lock him away. They humiliated him. And that was enough. He never tried again. Another child, a girl of about 9, began tending to the dying. She wiped their faces, sang to them, tried to give them water when no one was watching. One night, she was found sitting by a fevered child, her own body trembling. The next morning, both were gone. No record, no grave, just another mound of dirt, another silence. Even among the caretakers, there were those who began to break. Not publicly, not dramatically, but in small, private ways. A man who once led daily prayers stopped speaking altogether. A woman who enforced punishments began sobbing into her apron each night, then washing her face before sunrise to resume the routine. They were trapped in the same system they had helped build, unable to admit they were wrong, unwilling to ask for help. Because to do so would be to admit that their purity, their righteousness had become cruelty, that their mission to save had become a machinery of death. And so they too chose silence. And that silence became the coffin for every child who still remained. By the 7th week, the punishment stopped, not out of mercy, but because there was no one left to punish. Most of the children who could still walk were too sick to be scolded. The rules became meaningless. The routines fell apart. The hymns ceased. The home, once filled with discipline, order, and spiritual instruction, had become a hollow chamber of ghosts. The doctrine that once shaped its walls had collapsed under the weight of its own inhumanity. In the final days, a few children tried to hold on to the rituals they had been taught. A boy knelt in prayer by the side of a dying friend, whispering verses through broken breaths. A girl tried to sing a hymn, but her voice cracked after 3 words. Another child, fevered and delirious, asked if she was still worthy, if the pain she felt meant she had been good. No one answered, because there was no one left to lie to them. The caretakers had fled or fallen. The building groaned with rot and silence, and in that silence, the full weight of the shattered vows came crashing down. This was not just a home that failed. It was a system that imploded, a belief structure that cannibalized the very people it claimed to protect. The children had been taught that obedience would save them, that purity would shield them, that suffering would redeem them. Instead, it became their punishment. And in that final summer, as the heat bore down and the graves grew deeper, every prayer, every punishment, every silent cry became a testimony, not of righteousness, but of ruin. The home had demanded silence. It had demanded discipline. It had demanded purity. What it gave was death. And what it left behind was a silence that echoed for generations. When the last child died, the walls did not collapse. The sky did not darken. There was no thunder, no sign from above, no tremor beneath the earth. The home stood silent. And in that silence, the only witness to what had unfolded were the trees that bent under summer winds and the soil that had swallowed 45 bodies. But even the earth, for all its patience and depth, could not keep such secrets forever. In time, nature began to whisper what history had tried to bury. The forgotten graves began to echo, wordlessly, painfully, like a wound beneath the skin of the land. The burial process at the home had never been ceremonial. There were no coffins, no headstones, no dates carved into wood. There was only necessity. The dead were wrapped in tattered cloth or old bed sheets, tied with rope at the feet and neck, and carried through the back door in the night. 2 caretakers would dig while a third held a lantern. The holes were shallow, dug hurriedly into soil that had not been meant for graves. Often the bodies were stacked 2 or 3 to a pit. When the ground became too dense or the caretakers too weak, the graves grew shallower. In some, only a few inches of soil separated the dead from the air. By the end of August, the backfield behind the home, once used for potatoes and late summer squash, had become a makeshift cemetery. Rows didn't exist. Order didn't matter. Graves were scattered across the uneven terrain, clustered in haphazard patterns like the panic that had placed them there. Grass refused to grow. The ground, disturbed and unsettled, shifted with each storm. Heavy rains revealed corners of white cloth, small bones, pieces of broken toys buried with the bodies. No one reburied what the water unearthed. They simply looked away. When the home was finally abandoned, left to rot and collapse, the graves remained, unmarked, untended, forgotten. The prairie reclaimed the land as it always does. Vines climbed the decaying fence. Wild grasses crept over the sunken mounds. Animals returned, deer grazing near the orchard, foxes sniffing through the garden. By the time the Civil War began 50 years later, most in the region had never even heard of the Childcare home. The town grew in the opposite direction. New farms were planted, new roads paved, and the forgotten children were erased from maps and memories alike. But not from the land. In the early 1900s, a family attempted to homestead the property. They cleared brush, built a small cabin, and planted apple trees. Within weeks, they reported strange occurrences. Dogs that wouldn't enter the backfield, children who refused to play near the barn, soil that, despite tilling and fertilizing, would not yield crops. In the nights, the couple claimed to hear sounds, soft weeping, footsteps across floorboards that no longer existed, the rustling of leaves in windless air. They left by winter. Locals chalked it up to folklore, superstition. But over the decades, similar stories emerged. Every time someone tried to build on that land, something would go wrong. Foundations would crack, crops would fail, animals would avoid the property. In one case, a young girl playing near the area came home sobbing. "The ground feels sad," she said, inconsolable for days. Yet even then, no one thought to dig deeper, literally or figuratively. It wasn't until 1974 that the first physical evidence reappeared. A severe summer storm flooded the fields. Erosion along the rear slope of the property unearthed what appeared to be human remains. Bones, small ones, a child's ribcage, a partial skull. Locals called the sheriff. The area was cordoned off briefly, but without clear jurisdiction or historical records, physical evidence reappeared. A severe summer storm flooded the fields. Erosion along the rear slope of the property unearthed what appeared to be human remains. Bones, small ones, a child's ribcage, a partial skull. Locals called the sheriff. The area was cordoned off briefly, but without clear jurisdiction or historical records. The investigation was closed in less than a week. The remains were reburied quietly. No forensic analysis, no exhumation, no names. That same year, a local historian, curious about the incident, began combing through early 19th century property logs. He found mention of a children's sanctuary established in 1809 and shuttered in 1813. No reason was given, no final report. The home, it seemed, had simply ceased to exist, except it hadn't. The graves remained, waiting. In 1998, a drought exposed more. Cracks in the earth revealed long-forgotten burial sites. A hiker walking along the edge of the property stumbled across sunken depressions in the ground, uniform in size and spacing. He counted 27, all the size of a child's bed. Archaeologists were contacted, but the landowner refused excavation. "It's just old dirt," he said. "Let the past stay buried." And so it did. To this day, the graves have never been formally exhumed. No memorial has been raised. No plaque stands at the edge of that field. 45 children, buried in silence, remain beneath the grass and roots and unspoken shame of a forgotten corner of Illinois. Occasionally, bones resurface during floods. Occasionally, someone retells the story in hushed tones. But mostly, the graves lie quiet, as they always have. But the earth does not forget. It remembers in the bent trees whose trunks twist unnaturally near the burial mounds. It remembers in the way grass grows thicker over some plots and not at all over others. It remembers in the strange chill that rises from the soil on warm days. It remembers in the absence of birdsong. It remembers when it rains too hard or not at all, when wind sounds like whispers and fields feel heavy underfoot. And if the earth remembers, then so must we. Because the silence around these graves is not natural. It is constructed, layered, intentional. A silence built not out of peace, but out of fear. A fear that if we look too closely, we will see ourselves, not in the victims, but in the bystanders, in the ones who said nothing, did nothing, in the ones who decided that children without parents, without titles, without power, could be laid to rest without names. This was not just a loss of life. It was a loss of memory, of dignity, of identity. Every child buried in that field had a face, a voice, a story, a first word, a favorite toy, a laugh that echoed once in hallways now long gone. They had dreams, even if only whispered at night under itchy blankets. They had fears. They held hands with other children. They cried when hurt, smiled when praised. They were real. And now they are hidden under decades of soil and silence. But if we listen closely, if we stand in that field, in the right season, in the right light, we may still hear them. Not with our ears, but with our conscience. Because these are not just forgotten graves. They are reminders. Reminders of what happens when care becomes control, when discipline becomes cruelty, when purity becomes punishment, when oversight becomes absence, and when death becomes easier to bury than truth. The echoes in the earth are not ghosts. They are questions. Who were they? Why were they left? And how long will we keep pretending that we don't hear them? The graves still breathe beneath the soil, soft, slow, waiting. And until they are named, until they are known, their silence will haunt more than just the land. It will haunt the soul of a country that once called itself free, yet allowed 45 children to die unheard, then buried their memory in the very dirt they slept on. A tragedy becomes history when we choose to remember it. But what becomes of a tragedy when no one speaks its name? What becomes of it when there are no headlines, no monuments, no apologies, no justice? It fades. It withers beneath layers of dust and time. It slips between the cracks of official records and slips out of the minds of the living. That is what happened to the 45 children who died in the summer of 1812 in the Illinois Childcare home. They weren't just buried in the earth, they were buried in silence. And in that silence, the most dangerous force of all was born. Not disease, not violence, not even death, but forgetting. Forgetting didn't happen all at once. It never does. It happened gradually, like the dimming of a flame. First, their names were lost, then their stories, then their graves. By the time the home had collapsed into rot and ruin, no one alive in the town could name a single child who once lived there. No one knew their birthdays. No one remembered what songs they sang. No one told the story of how they died. The records that should have existed, daily logs, burial documents, letters for help, never surfaced. Perhaps they were destroyed. Perhaps they were never written. Or perhaps they were hidden, locked in the drawers of local authorities who decided the shame was too great. And so the children vanished from paper. Without documentation, their existence could not be proven. Without names, their suffering could not be mourned. Without mourning, their deaths could not be grieved. And without grief, there was nothing to hold on to. America moved forward. It built towns, railroads, industries. It fought wars, ended slavery, created states, wrote laws. It printed textbooks and taught generations about revolution, independence, and progress. But it never told the story of the home where 45 children died in one summer because no one came to help. Because no one thought they mattered. Because they had no family, no voice, no wealth, and no value in a system that measured worth by what you could offer, not by who you were. And so the country forgot them. And in forgetting them, it learned how easy it is to forget others like them. Because the legacy of this tragedy isn't just what happened in 1812, it's what continued to happen afterward. Again and again, in different states, in different homes, in different forms, under different names. Children forgotten in the margins. Children punished for being poor. Children neglected behind walls painted with charity and covered with the language of care. Children who died slowly, silently, without the world ever knowing. This home was not the last. In the decades that followed, other institutions would rise and fall. Orphanages where abuse ran unchecked. Asylums where the vulnerable were left to starve. Reform schools where discipline was just another word for pain. Even into the 20th century, stories emerged of children lost, children harmed, children erased. But because the story of 1812 was never told, no one connected the dots. No one saw the pattern, and the forgetting continued. But the land remembers. The children buried beneath Illinois soil remain. They do not rise, they do not cry out, but they remain. And their legacy, though buried, is not gone. It lingers in the questions left unanswered. It echoes in the way we talk about forgotten tragedies today. When a child dies in the system, we say it is unfortunate. When a home closes due to scandal, we say it is isolated. When an abuse case emerges, we say it is rare. But none of it is rare. What is rare is truth. What is rare is memory. And memory is the only thing that can protect the dead from being lost again. For these 45 children, there are no school photos, no yearbooks, no family albums, no statues. They exist only in the soil and in the silence. But if we listen, if we stop and listen, they begin to appear. Not as ghosts, but as reminders of what happens when society decides that some lives matter less than others. Of what happens when institutions are left to operate in darkness. Of what happens when good people remain quiet and bad systems go unchecked. Their legacy is not just sorrow, it is warning, because the systems that failed them still exist in other forms. Systems that value efficiency over empathy. Systems that call cruelty discipline. Systems that leave the most vulnerable unprotected. Every time we allow a child to go unseen, unheard, uncared for, we repeat the mistake. Every time we prioritize saving face over saving lives, we write another chapter in the book of forgetting. Every time we walk past the graves of the unknown and feel nothing, we deny the pain that built the very ground we walk on. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can remember, we can uncover, we can name, we can mourn. Because these children did not die in a natural disaster. They were not victims of war. They were not lost in a moment of sudden violence. They died over weeks and weeks of preventable pain. They died of neglect, of silence, of abandonment. They died because they were invisible. And now the only thing more tragic than their death would be our choice to let them stay invisible. Their legacy, then, is in our hands. We who tell the story, we who speak their names, even if we never knew them. We who demand that forgotten children never be forgotten again. The land still holds their bones. The wind still carries their silence. But we, if we choose to listen, can carry something else. We can carry their truth. We can carry their memory. We can carry their legacy forward, not as a ghost story, but as a mirror, to see not what they lost, but what we must never lose again. Now, more than 2 centuries later, the wind still blows across that forgotten field in Illinois. The soil is quiet, the graves remain unmarked, and history, if left untouched, will continue to pass by, unaware, indifferent, blind to the 45 children buried beneath its feet. But silence is not eternal. Not if we choose to listen, not if we choose to speak. And so we stand here not to rewrite history, but to unearth it, to give voice to those who had none, to name what was denied a name, to finally, painfully begin to break the silence. This was never just a story about a building that fell apart or a disease that spread through an overcrowded hall. It was about what happens when compassion is replaced by order, when discipline outweighs empathy, when suffering is ignored in the name of righteousness. It was about a country still young, already growing powerful, but not yet learning how to care for its weakest. The 45 children who died that summer in 1812 will never return. Their lives were lost to a system that was supposed to protect them, forgotten by a nation too busy to look back. But they are not erased, not completely, because with every word spoken in their memory, every truth uncovered from beneath the weight of dust and shame, they rise. Not in body, but in story. Not in presence, but in purpose. Their story is a reckoning. A reminder that the foundation of any nation is not built by its armies or its monuments, but by how it treats its most vulnerable. And if a country cannot remember the children it failed, then it risks failing again. So let us not turn away. Let us not bury this truth once more beneath the soft lies of nostalgia or the hard walls of pride. Let us kneel, if only in spirit, before the soil where these children lie, and whisper the one thing they were never given in life. We see you now. We hear you now. We remember you now. Let this not be the end of the story, but the beginning of the memory. Let the echo of their silence turn into the roar of remembrance. Let the forgotten graves become sacred ground, not just in Illinois, but in every place where injustice has buried its shame. Let every child who has ever suffered in silence find a voice in our telling, a name in our remembrance, and a place in our collective heart. The silence ends here, and in its place, truth begins.